The Middletown Township Historical Society is pleased to welcome you to our August meeting and our guest speaker, John Fabiano. Those who have done local history, either research or writing, know that it is hard work. Those who consume the history often just want the facts, but the facts are often obscure. Uncovering them can be like a detective story. And John Fabiano has placed many years of his career detecting the true story behind Molly Pitcher. Or is it multiple Molly Pitchers? He's going to give us some insight. John has recently retired after 10 years as executive director of the Monmouth County Historical Commission, so perhaps he will have more time to engage in his passion, the Revolution of New Jersey. John, tell us now about Molly Pitcher.
Thank you, everyone. Tom, Randy, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, Randy, you're correct. The story of Molly Pitcher is quite complicated, if in fact there really was a Molly Pitcher. My title of my program is A Servant at Mrs. Watkins, Local Origins of Molly Pitcher. In his published 1876 Centennial Discourse, Reverend George Swain stated that the famous Molly Pitcher was the daughter of Allentown's John Hannah, and that she had been a servant in the family of militia captain James Burr. This claim was contrary to more traditional accounts, which identify her as either Carlisle's Mary Hayes Macaulay or West Point's Margaret Corbin. I partnered with my neighbors Ann Garrison and Alice Wyckoff to determine if the Reverend Swain was correct. Initially, we were encouraged by research locating Weaver John Hannah's 7-acre homestead in Allentown and inclusion in his will a daughter, Mary Kavanaugh, and granddaughter Nancy. We also found a John Kavanaugh on a 4th New Jersey war casualty list, which would support the legend. I assume that everyone knows the legend of Molly's husband or gallant who was struck down at the cannon, and that she took up the cannon and fired it. But is that really the story? Let me continue. We also decided to redirect our research and attempted to reconstruct the community in which Molly lived. This resulted in a Revolutionary War history, Allentown, a crossroads of the American Revolution, which enlightened many about Allentown's strategic and therefore military importance. James Burr's mother, Eleanor Price, brother, Isaac, had owned and operated a fulling mill, which supported Weaver John Hannah's craft. A crucial council of war on June 24th, 1778 was held in the Hopewell house of John Price Hunt, son of Wilson Hunt and Susanna Price. At this time, the British temporarily occupied Allentown on their march across New Jersey, and any intelligence on their military defenses would be welcomed by Washington. Was this the breakthrough we were seeking to unlock Allentown's Molly Pitcher secrets? What if someone from Allentown who had observed the British and Hessian troop strength and recorded their defensive positions was able to travel to Hopewell? Could this heroic act have been the basis for the legend of Molly Pitcher in Allentown? Washington's aide-de-camp, Robert Henry Harrison's Monmouth campaign expense included a $1 payment to a servant at Mrs. Watkins by the general's orders, dated June 27th at Cranberry. What if Mary Hannah was able to travel with her mistress Eleanor to visit her relatives in Hopewell and provided Washington with intelligence? Could this have been a payment to Mary for her services, and since there would be a price on her head, have her taken to Mrs. Watkins for safekeeping? Subsequent research into Mrs. Lydia Watkins, daughter of Richard Stillwell, who lived in Shrewsbury, specifically the Allen House, revealed a family of sisters engaged on both sides of the Revolutionary War conflict. Of the 6 beautiful sisters, as they were known, 3 married British officers of distinction, and the daughter of Anne, Theodosia, would marry a British officer, and later Aaron Burr. At Paramus, Mrs. Watkins was scheduled to host Washington and his senior staff on their march north after Monmouth. But he was enticed by Theodosia to stay in her nearby home, the Hermitage, instead. Although still married to Colonel Jacques Prévost of the New Royal Regiment, she would soon after accompany Colonel Aaron Burr into Manhattan to ostensibly visit her aunts, but more likely to gather intelligence, which Burr was tasked to do. Upon Colonel Prevost's 1781 death in the Caribbean, Theodosia and Aaron would marry. Essentially, that's an abstract of the story I'm going to tell. It's good to get it out there because it is a long story. There's a lot of detail and there's a lot of complicated connections here, and I'd like to go through it. And another thing I'd like to say before we begin is that since I've retired, I've had some chance to look at this further. And I believe I have possibly 2 and maybe even 3 separate stories here. So bear with me and I will sort this out. So this is probably the last time I'm presenting this story of Molly in this form. Thank you. What we have here in the first slide is the Union Metallic Cartridge Company Chrome Lithograph Calendar. I happen to have a personal copy of this. This is not my copy. And it shows Molly, as we traditionally know her, firing the cannon. Her husband, or gallant, as he's referred to, is lying by the side there. And it's just a typical depiction. Next. Oh, I have this. Thank you. This is the earliest anecdote. Back in 2003, Molly Pitcher source book was written and published by Dr. David Martin, president of the Friends of the Monmouth Battlefield. I assisted him in this book. We both explored the Molly Pitcher story from perspectives throughout history. This is the earliest published account in 1830. It predates even Dr. Martin's source. In it, it says that, "No," Molly said, fixing her eyes upon the officer, "the cannon shall not be removed for the want of someone to serve it. Since my brave husband is no more, I will ask you my utmost exertions to avenge his death. General Washington gave her the rank of lieutenant and granted her half pay during her life. She wore an epaulet and everyone called her Captain Molly." This is the traditional account. This is derivative and it will continue for years of essentially the same story. But some key points in here are that it's at the beginning, it says before the battle even began, before the cannonading, which the battle was famous for, had begun. And it says that it was a skirmish that happened before, which is unusual because most people place Molly with the entire battery up on Perrine Hill during the intense cannonade that occurred. I like to think of Molly in a different way. This is Molly being presented to George Washington, Dennis Malone Carter, 1856 painting. This is his second painting of the battle. His first was of the battle itself. This shows General Greene introducing Molly Pitcher to George Washington and Baron von Steuben. Now here, Molly is not, it looks like she hadn't been fighting in a battle. She's got a very elegant dress, and she is wearing an artillery coat, as distinguished by the green color and the red facing. Now, I'm from Allentown, was president of the Allentown Historical Society for a long time, and I didn't study history in school, but my neighbor approached me back around the turn of the century and said, "We really need to do something to protect Allentown from development." And I said, "Well, what can we do?" At the time, I was president of the Historical Society, and I said, "I will help her." She said, "Well, we have tradition that Molly Pitcher was from Allentown." And I said, "Well, we should work on that." And we did. We spent at least 2 years of researching Molly Pitcher. We didn't know what we were doing. She was a planner by trade. I was a budget accountant from the state of New Jersey. But I was fortunate to work in Trenton and had access to a lot of the material there. So daily, I would go to work and at lunchtime go either to the archives or the library and get answers to the questions that Anne had posed the following morning. So I'd wake up every morning and there'd be a list of questions and she'd want answers to them. And this went back and forth for 2 years. But what happened was that we accumulated so much history about Allentown during the Revolution that we had to put the Molly Pitcher question aside because it was so controversial. And we produced a 100-page document that we still rely on now to prevent development from occurring. In fact, I don't know if anybody is aware of it, but we're currently now fighting warehouse development right on our border with Upper Freehold. And it's because of this research that we're able to do that and justify preservation of that land. But let me continue. Back to Allentown and the story there. Reverend Swain of the Allentown Presbyterian Church delivered his discourse, which was required in 1876 or requested by the presbytery for the ministers to write a history of their church. And in it, he says, moreover, from among us, it is said, the famous Molly Pitcher, who at the Battle of Monmouth acted the role of cannoneer in place of her husband, or some other brave who had fallen beside his gun. She was reputed to have been the daughter of one John Hannah of Allentown, was of North Ireland extraction, and had been for a time a servant in the family of the father of Captain James Brewer. This is not the only source that identifies Hannah as Molly Pitcher. E.M. Woodward, in his 1883 History of Burlington, identifies her in a footnote. It says here, number 2, the author is indebted to J. O'Hare, Ordnance Sergeant, USA, in charge of Post Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, for the following interesting item. Molly Pitcher, the daughter of John Hannah of Allentown, and the wife of a cannoneer named John Mabon, because that was the name believed to be. Now, Mabon and Kavanaugh are similar if written in script. So it's highly possible that it was either mispronounced, as a lot of words were then, and people were, we do history, we know that we look for phonetic spelling. So Mabon and Kavanaugh is really not that far apart. But says she obtained her sobriquet for carrying water to the soldiers of her husband's battery during the battle and lies buried in the old cemetery of Carlisle. And then continues the story of the woman in Carlisle. Here's her gravesite. But here's the enigma known as Sarah Smith Stafford. The only daughter of James Baird Stafford. Stafford was called to Allentown to become a tutor in the academy, the Presbyterian Academy, which was established during the Revolutionary War, surprisingly, as a separate academy attached to the Presbyterian Church. And our local historian written about her, Miss Stafford, here. And it was written that from her childhood, Miss Stafford was to say, clad in a petticoat of red, white, and blue. She wore her patriotism with pride and sincerity and was the custodian of many valuable relics of the Revolution, as well as the only person of her sex who had been honored with a membership in the New Jersey Historical Society. This woman is the source of Swain's discourse that mentions Molly Pitcher. Her father, here's a wonderful etching of him as the tutor, said he wore the queue and the breeches well into the 19th century. James Stafford appeared in Allentown about the year 1797, together with his wife, who was said to have been one Abigail Smith of near Boston. His occupation was that of a school teacher. He was for 7 years principal of the Allentown Academy, besides teaching elsewhere at various times. He was postmaster for 16 years, and he was also a justice of the peace. Until 1818, he wore a blue coat with brass buttons, knee breeches, ruffled shirt, cocked hat, and hair, long and tied in the queue, as you see here. At the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, James Barrett Stafford was in the mercantile business in New York. He refused the king's oath, went to Boston, and fitted out the privateer, the Kitty. He entered the service of the United States on the 18th of April, 1776, and served upon the said ship until captured by the frigate and the crew of the Kitty put in irons. The latter vessel was soon afterwards recaptured by John Paul Jones, and the irons placed upon the British crew. This is how the story was told. This was about 10 days before Jones' great naval fight, in which his vessel, the Bonhomme Richard, engaged the British Serapis. During the engagement, Jones' flag was shot away and fell into the sea when young Stafford leaped overboard and recovered the flag. I mean, really? He received a severe wound in the shoulder on this occasion from the sword of a British officer. The wound was well healed, and his old age caused him much pain. Mr. Stafford continued in the naval service of the United States until the crew of the Alliance, of which he was a member, was discharged per resolution of Congress. His discharge is dated Thursday, February 19th, 1794, signed by Commodore Barry under the Act of Congress. He received a pension of $120 per annum during his life. The most important relic of Miss Stafford is at Philadelphia, it being the first American flag recognized by foreign powers and the one shot from the masthead of the Bonhomme Richard in the engagement with the Serapis. While its identity has never been assailed, there has been much discussion as to whether it was really the first American flag. Miss Stafford is positive and has much evidence on her side. Lieutenant Stafford was transferred with the flag to the Alliance, and the colors were used upon that vessel until the close of the war, when they were presented by act of Congress to the lieutenant for his bravery, and have been in the family ever since. They were exhibited at the great sanitary fair held in New York and Philadelphia and at Lexington last year. The flag was originally 11 feet long by 6 feet 5 inches wide, but the length has been reduced to 9 feet. It is a bunting with 13 red and white stripes and 12 stars upon the blue field. It was made in 1777 by ladies of the old Swedish church in Philadelphia. Now, all that's according to Sarah Smith Stafford. The flag was given to the Smithsonian Institution, and it wasn't until the 1930s that they determined it was a fake. Who knows how many of the relics that this woman acquired are real? She became friends with Rutherford B Hayes, and in the Fremont, Ohio Museum, where his collections are, she donated her collections, and I plan a trip there someday to investigate all these relics to see what's real and what's not. This woman and her family made a fortune off this flag. They traveled throughout the country explaining this, and she's my source for Molly Pitcher. So you could see the difficulty I'm having in putting the story together. So, but, and this is a big but, she did have the memory of the Revolutionary War through her father, and her father did not serve with Paul Jones, who everybody knew at that time, but another Commodore, John Barry. In fact, he's the father of the American Navy, born in Wexford, along with James Stafford. They were friends. And in fact, James Barrett Stafford was, according to this recommendation that he was receiving for a job from John Barry, it said that the bearer is my friend, James Barrett Stafford. I've known him from his youth. He served under me as a midshipman and acting lieutenant in the Continental Frigate Alliance. That's true. And served in the letter of marque the Kitty in the other armed vessel during the war. He was honorably discharged from the service by me by the order of the Agent of Marine as per resolution of Congress. This is the important point. At the request of the Secret Committee of Congress, I sent him with a message from them to Henry Lawrence Esquire, the prisoner in the Tower of London, the duty he performed with great fidelity and success. Now, Henry Lawrence was made ambassador to the Dutch. He was former president of the Continental Congress. He was captured at sea, and he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. So imagine this gentleman, Stafford, took this letter, and him and Barry sailed over to England, dropped him off most likely in Ireland, Wexford, and somehow he had gotten to Lawrence, essentially was saying, don't swear the oath, don't give in, we'll get you out of there. And they did eventually, after peace, he was released. Or actually he was released before then because he was a member of the Peace Committee. So Sarah Stafford had some memory of the Revolutionary War. It appears, though, that she got some of the facts mixed up, to say the least. Now back to Mary Hannah and her claim that Mary Hannah was the Molly Pitcher. Here's tax. Good thing it's a really big screen. Here's a tax roll from Upper Freehold. You can see John Hannah here, very bottom, fortunately, with his 7 acres, and he had a couple cattle, and he was taxed 24 pounds, 13 shillings, and 2 pence. Not so bad. Not so bad a living. Sarah Smith Stafford, in an 1879 letter, she wrote, P.S. I will write to you soon about Molly Pitcher or Hannah. She was the sister to Betty Ager, wife of Hugh Ager. Their father was John Hannah, an Irish weaver, and lived opposite the Presbyterian Church in Allentown. Hannah's will, John Hannah's will, dated March 14th, 1781, bequeath. Fifthly, I bequeath unto my daughter Mary Kavanaugh 1 feather bed with new striped tick, a bolster hand-turned bedstead and cord, and also a new silk handkerchief, and 1 black heifer for granddaughter Nancy Kavanaugh. So she had a daughter, supposedly. Now, here's John Kavanaugh, Mary's husband, on an enlistment. And remember, I said before, he appeared on a casualty list, but he also deserted for 6 months. They would sometimes desert during the summer months to take care of the fields and then come back and reenlist. And he did reenlist. So I suspect that casualty was, he was on that casualty list because of that desertion on his record. He was enlisted by our local Lieutenant William Barton, son of Gilbert, in Captain Lyon's company, Ephraim Martin's 4th Regiment, on March 5th, 1778. This was when he reenlisted. Now here's the house that still exists in Allentown, we believe is John Hannah's house. The west wing, the right side, was built in 1760. It was estimated, and circa 1800 for the east wing. It's known as the S. Potter House. It's directly across the street from the Allentown Presbyterian Church. Now, when I first started to investigate this, I had recently received a master's degree. In fact, it compelled me to go back to school to get a master's degree and find out how to do this research properly, because again, we had produced this 100-page document, and yet I wasn't necessarily a trained historian at that time. So I decided, let me go back to school, my last years working for the state of New Jersey, and get a degree. And after that, I had a little more confidence. And I was going through this book, which is a wonderful book, a compendium of artifacts throughout the state put together by the New Jersey State Museum. And in it, on the same page, there's these 2 items. One here is an unidentified artist, and it's in the old barracks collection of Molly Pitcher, early 19th century painting. And the other was the hunting sword, and it just happened to be the hunting sword of Captain James Bruere. that was donated to the Monmouth County Historical Association. It's circa 1750 silver-mounted hunting sword with black leather scabbard, grips of ivory, stained green with lion's head pommel, 30 3/4 inches. Now, they appear essentially on the same page, and it tells the story of the traditional Molly Pitcher, Mary Ludwig Hayes, 7th Pennsylvania Regiment of Artillery, Carlisle, that whole thing. But at the same time, we've got Bruer's hunting sword. So I don't know if somebody knew something, but this sort of led me to believe maybe there's a connection here. But believe me, this was not the reason why I decided to follow this story the way I did. Here's Bruer's grave site in the Allentown Presbyterian Yard. Now, without getting into the detail here, this is from our Charles Hutchinson papers. We wouldn't be, in Allentown, we wouldn't be as knowledgeable as we happen to be if it wasn't for this gentleman, Charles Hutchinson, who around the turn of the last century had written all this local history. And then, unbelievably, he handwrote in these ledgers that have since been acquired by the New Jersey Historical Society. And they're wonderful documents. So he started to do his family genealogy. Hutchinson, he's part Robbins, his middle initials is R. And then later, though, he started to collect all the material he could, mostly deeds, a lot of also genealogical information, vital statistics, things like that. But because he had accumulated so much, he had devised a way to index things. He created an early database. What you see here is an abstract of the record, which then follow sequentially in the latter parts of these ledgers. And we have a key number to the far right. And to look up that record, all you really need to do is to go to the margin and you find that number. But he's listed everything in such a way that he's got it by family name above, and the left side, the given name. So if you're looking for somebody trying to help people do genealogy, things like that, this is an incredible document. We have it on microfilm. We're very fortunate, and we're able to access it because of this system that he set up where we're able to query it. And this document's over 150 years old, and it's almost like a computer program. But here shows Peter Bruer, his wife, the connection to Isaac Price and the family. And since then, I was able to, I don't have to go through the genealogy to say that I found how really close these families were. Here's another clue. This was from F.B. Lee's genealogy of Mercer County, and it shows a Mary Dagworthy Hunt Bruer. Later, one of the descendants had married Joseph Bruer, who was president of the bank, and they lived in Princeton, and they were very well off. And led me to believe that maybe there's a connection here between the families. And the Price name helped quite a bit. Here's the Allentown Mill. And this is a Hessian map from the West Jersey Society. And it's a Hessian map, and it shows June 24th, 1778. Not only was Allentown occupied by the British, but another division led by Hessian General Knyphausen was in Imlaystown, and that was the baggage that came out of Philadelphia. So as they marched across New Jersey, Knyphausen took the baggage and the more vulnerable troops, and they went below Allentown. The first division came from Crosswicks into Allenstown and shielded the troops in Imlaystown. And this just shows the extent of the activity prior to the Battle of Monmouth. Okay, most of you recognize this. This is from the Battle Monument in Freehold. It's by James Edward Kelly, Council of War at Hopewell. And from left to right, it's DePortal, Steuben, Poor, Knox, Sterling, Lafayette, Scammell, Washington, standing, facing us, Patterson, Scott, Wayne, Green, Wofford, and Lee. And this is the Council of War that was held in Hopewell on the same date that Allentown was occupied by the entire British Army. This is the house known as the Joseph Stout House, even though it was occupied by John Price Hunt at the time. Again, he was the son of Wilson Sr. and Susanna Price Hunt. Stonebank House, built in 1752. Washington's headquarters from June 23rd to the 25th. Washington chose Lafayette to lead in advance after Lee declined, but Lee subsequently pulls rank after troop size was increased. And it was these troops that marched to encounter the British. Here's the original receipt of payment for the lodgings. Bryce Hunt. General Washington's family debit to John Hunt. He's being paid in hard currency at the time. And it was, here's the expense account. And this is the link to the second part of this story. This is the second really history I'm going to talk about. But right here it says, after the 27th to Dr. Stites in Cranberry. This is essentially the itinerary. They stayed with Wetherell in Kingston, Stites in Cranberry, and then out of nowhere to his servant at Mrs. Watkins by the general's orders, $1. And this is the expense account that was submitted by his aide-de-camp, Robert Henry Harrison. Now here's Lydia Stillwell. Lydia Stillwell, born in 1726, was the wife of John Watkins and youngest of the 6 beautiful sisters of Richard Stillwell and Mercy Sands, who lived in Monmouth County Historical Association's Allen House. Watkins was a West Indian merchant at St. Christopher's who resided at Harlem Heights, near the home of Colonel Roger Morris. John Watkins was constrained to live abroad during the Revolutionary War, which caused Lydia to vacate Watkins Glen. Yes, it was known as Watkins Glen, and their son founded the town of Watkins Glen, New York. It became a popular resort of, this is important, her house, after it was vacated during the British occupation, became a popular resort of the British officers when quartered in the neighborhood, and who kept it in working order during the war, so she had a roof over her head when peace returned. A British officer wrote, "I had the honor of taking possession of these handsome dwellings, filled with furniture and other valuable articles, lawful prizes of war, but the owners fled, leaving all their slaves behind." Here's the mother, Mercy Sands. She's from Block Island, of all things. Still was from New York City. Here's the Allen House in Shrewsbury. I'm sure you're all familiar with. Here's another sister, Elizabeth, was 3 years older. She married first Captain Peter Wraxall, who died in the French and Indian War, and subsequently his friend, Lieutenant, there's Wraxall. He was assistant to the supervisor, or how was it said, the commissary of Indian Affairs for the British Army. So he's quite an important person in the British ranks. His friend, Lieutenant John Monsell, married her after he had passed, who said that she was a very beautiful woman, possessed of great force of character, but whom every womanly element predominated. Now that's from John E. Stillwell. Now, most of us in Monmouth County who are familiar with doing genealogy research, we really, I think we rely quite a bit on John E. Stillwell. He's got a 5-volume set of genealogical information that is incredibly valuable. Usually it's, he's got individual families, key families from Monmouth County. And then all the information that he obtained there is quite valuable, especially when looking at the indexes and the interrelationships between the families. But when it comes to his own family, the Stillwell family, he really did outdo himself. There are 2 or 3, possibly 3 separate volumes, these large books of the family in detail with quite a bit of photographs with their individual collections. And it tells quite an interesting story. General Monsell, commanded the 60th Regiment during the Siege of Havana. This is their estate. They, with Watkins, in 1767, purchased land in Harlem, just north of City College. Pinehurst, built by Monsell and Elizabeth, was the site of the Battle of Harlem Heights. The general had consciously decided to forego the conflict between loyalty to his king and affection for his wife, her kindred, and many friends. His position was trying. Accepting half pay commanding in Ireland, he and his wife departed in 1775, and not until 1784 did they return. As a British subject, he was not allowed to hold property. Therefore, he petitioned the New York legislature in 1790 and received permission to hold property up to £10,000 in value. Now, that's saying a lot. Here's a general, a British general, allowed to return to New York so soon after peace was declared, and then eventually gets to receive his property back. So tells me something's going on with these people that is not the way things are normally done. Here's where their house was located. Located over near the tavern in the middle there. And above you could see the Morris House, which was Washington's headquarters. Hamilton lived up in that area. His Grange was up in that area too. In fact, the Morris House is still, the Jumel Morris Mansion is still open today and can be visited. Now, here's the most interesting of the sisters. This is the eldest of the firstborn twins. Her name was Mary, who married 1745 Captain Thomas Clark, a gentleman considerably older, who died leaving a large estate. He bought a fine piece of property between 23rd and 28th Street he named Chelsea, after the famed London Old Veterans Home. After the original house burned down, Mistress Molly, as she was called, being a capable and energetic woman, set to work to build the house. Mrs. Clark's loyalty to the American cause was much questioned, and her policy was doubtless one of prudence than of affection for the struggling country. Her children, however, with the impetuosity of youth, were more outspoken and were dubbed the Tory brood. Her son, Clement C. Clark, was listed as a loyalist in Sabine's. Now, Molly was a woman of agency. She had quite a lot of authority. Oh, here's her husband, who died many years before the war. Here's the residence after it was enlarged years later, residence of the late Bishop Moore. Was her son-in-law. During the conflict, being advised to stick to the property, Mary had a number of American soldiers billeted upon her, which caused much distress, till one of the officers represented the matter to Washington, who personally rode to the house and gave orders by which the family were relieved from the American troops. Now here's a neat map. At the very bottom, you can see Abraham Mortier, Esquire. That's where his house was located on the west side here. And then up above, you can see how large Captain Clark's estate was. And this is the road network at that time. Here's Mordier's house, which would have been Washington's headquarters. This will come up later in the program. This is the twin sister. Now, these are women, adult women, and they had these lovely silk brocade gowns. And yet they have matching gowns. But you could tell them apart because the embroidery flower faces one way here. And if I go back to her sister, faces to her right. Her sister, same dress, but the embroidery is face to the left. Just thought that was a cute thing going on there. So here's Mary had met with Washington, which at that time might have been some opportunity for them to discuss the family, the Stillwells, and the family that was still loyal. That would be Anne Stillwell, Mary's twin, in 1748 married Theodosia Bartow, whose missionary father was sent to Westchester County and was a leader in Shrewsbury's Christ Church. While Anne was pregnant with her daughter in 1746, her husband suffered a fatal carriage accident, and Theodosia was named after her deceased father. Anne would subsequently marry Captain Philip de Visme in 1751. According to John E. Stillwell, she possessed good business capacity and evidently managed a large estate or a mercantile venture. They lived at the National Historic Landmark known as the Hermitage in Hohokus. Here's Bartow's grave, which is in the center aisle, or one of the aisles, at Christ Church in Shrewsbury. Here's Peter. This is Captain Philip de Visme, who died in 1762. So these are widows, mostly, during the Revolutionary War period. Here's the house, which, even though this family lived there, is a national landmark because of the Gothic architecture, revival Gothic here. It's Hohokus, New Jersey. It's known as the Hermitage. Now, here's Anne's daughter, Theodosia. She's most interesting. Theodosia, after achieving what was referred to as a cosmopolitan education, would marry at the age of 17 years Colonel Jacques Marcus Prévost of the New Royal Regiment from Geneva, 10 years her senior. She and Jacques had 5 children. With her husband serving in Georgia and the Caribbean, she moved in with her mother. Here they lived in modest elegance. The ladies were accomplished and intelligent. For a long time, the residence was the center of the most polished society in the vicinity. They remained here during the Revolutionary War and entertained officers of both British and American armies alike. Quite an interesting arrangement. It was said of Theodosia, although she was not beautiful, disfigured by a forehead scar, she possessed mental endowments of so high an order. She was indeed in all respects a most estimable lady, affectionate, accomplished, and well-versed in literature, and was given to the practice as averse to the profession of piety. And think about that. Given to the practice of averse to the profession of piety. I guess she didn't suffer fools too well. This is an embroidery with silk. This is truly one of the few images we have of her. Other paintings have been attributed to her, but this is the one that shows most of the features. Here's her older husband. He was brother of General Augustine Prévost, who was quite important during this time period. Here, Washington takes his entire senior staff after the Battle of Monmouth and goes up to stay. Well, he was originally intended to stay with Mrs. Watkins, But then Theodosia takes it upon herself and coaxes him over to her place. She writes to him, Mrs. Provost presents her best respects to His Excellency General Washington, requests the honor of his company as she flatters herself in the accommodations will be more commodious than those to be procured in the neighborhood. Mrs. Prevost will be particularly happy to make her house agreeable to His Excellency and family. Dated the Hermitage, Friday morning at 11 o'clock. So Washington decides to stay with this woman. And then James McHenry writes about their stay there. And this is just written so well. Excuse me for reading it, but it says, we stopped at Mrs. Watkins, whose house was marked for headquarters, but the general receiving a note of invitation for Mrs. Prevost to make her Hermitage, as it was called, the seat of his stay. At Mrs. Prevost's, we found some fair refugees from New York who were on a visit to the lady of the Hermitage, and then we talked and we walked and we laughed and danced and gallanted away the leisure hours of 4 days and 4 nights, and would have gallanted and danced and laughed and talked and walked with them till now, had not the general given orders for our departure. We left them, however, in the spirit of modern soldiership, without much sighing, in pursuit of the dangers of war and pleasures of variety. I'm sorry. I get a kick out of that language. That's pretty flowery. That's McHenry. McHenry's Life and Correspondence. Okay. This is this is another expense account. And the important thing here is it's shown that Prevost's servants were paid separately. They were paid £4, 10 shillings and no pence. And yet Watkins' servant only got $1. And that Watkins' servant was paid $1 too, which is important because usually folks that were leaning towards the British side, they didn't want the discounted continental dollar. They wanted the hard currency, and which the British pound would have provided. Now, Mrs. Prevost seems to have become acquainted with Aaron Burr. I'll put it politely. This is an image of Aaron Burr. We should all be familiar with. Who, because of his brilliancy, was a much welcome guest at the Hermitage. Upon her husband's death, Colonel Burr was married to Theodosia Prevost, who was 10 years his senior, I'm sorry, on July 2nd, 1782 at the Hermitage. But prior to that, their marriage, this is a woodcut of Burr, who was stationed in Westchester County, getting in a boat to go visit his paramour, Mrs. Prevost, and he would have his men roam across the river there to go over to Bergen County, spend the night, and then I assume roam back to command his troops in Westchester. But it's amazing what you can find online these days. I mean, it just really is. Now, this is further proof that Theodosia, her aunt, and her aunts in New York, I believe, were the center of a spy ring. Lord Sterling gives orders here on July 4th from New Brunswick. He writes Burr and commands him to continue his intelligence gathering activity, which he was tasked with. And for this purpose, you may send 1, 2, or 3 trusty persons to the city to get reports, the newspapers, and the truth that they can. So approximately 1 month later, Burr is commanding a flag boat. The flag boat, the white flag, allowing them to cross between the lines, military lines, taking loyalists to the city, which interestingly includes Mrs. Prevost, her half-sister, Miss Devisme, and a servant, 1, 2, or 3, going into the city. And they spent about 5 days in the city visiting relatives and most likely the truth, if they can. And I believe that the estates that the women I had previously referred to, the aunts, were still being attended either by Mary Clark, we know was still there. Molly, she was known as. She would have met with Mrs. Prevost and provided some information. She might have gone up and visited the other estate up in Harlem, where the Watkins had left, but they left their estate intact, and it was a British headquarters. Who knows what she had done, but it appears as if she's in there gathering the intelligence per Sterling's orders. Now, here's another interesting account about the events of the day. You recognize her? The hairdo? Does it give it away? Anybody? Peggy Arnold, wife of the notorious Benedict. Notoriously involved in Arnold's plot to provide General Clinton the plans to West Point by way of Major Andre, whom Peggy previously knew intimately. Now, Peggy, this is according to Burr's memoirs, his history, his biography. The frantic seeds of West Point were renewed and continued so long as strangers were present, reads Burr's record. Mrs. Prevost was known as the wife of a British officer and connected with the royalists. In her, therefore, Mrs. Arnold could confide. As soon as they were left alone, Mrs. Arnold became tranquilized. Now, she'd been frantic prior to this, so if any of you are aware of the events. Left alone, Arnold left her stranded. She then instantly went into deliriums. But here she became tranquilized and assured Mrs. Prevost that she was heartily sick of the theatrics she was exhibiting. She stated that she had corresponded with the British commander, that she was disgusted with the American cause and those who had the management of public affairs, and that through great persuasion and unceasing perseverance, she had ultimately brought the general into an arrangement to surrender West Point to the British. She must have been quite worn out, good unsuspecting Major Franks, who was escorting her back to Philadelphia before he delivered to her. Amazing, this stuff. It just really is. Here's an image of Theodosia on the left, surprisingly, and the young Theodosia, Burr's daughter, who tragically died at sea years later, on the right. And back to Mortier's house. It was eventually purchased by Burr, and that's where Theodosia spent her last days, possibly reliving the events of the Revolutionary War. It became known as Richmond Hill. She died in 1794. And we're back to the brass relief of James Edward Kelly, Molly Pitcher at the Battle Monument. Okay, did I do well, Tom? Hour, get it in? Okay, now I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to leave a few slides because I suspect some of the questions might be regarding this image. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Both sides, and they were sort of insular because the British officers really like to be with the upper echelon of people that live in America.
Yes, it was quite fluid for the officers, especially. In fact, the officers could, I'm sure you read stories where officers would go on parole. General Lee, when he was captured, he was famously allowed to walk around New York City. In fact, Lee was in his glory there. It says he even gave some plans on how they could defeat the Americans while he was still within the service. And then he was returned, and that's, some folks suspect, why he was so reluctant to fight the British at the Battle of Monmouth. But that's a whole nother story. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, I missed the first part. Oh, the family he referred to was his aide de camps. Yeah, it was his staff. Yeah, his senior staff. Yeah. Inter Interesting stories about his aide de camps. In fact, Arthur Lefkowitz has written a wonderful book about his aide de camps. No, no, yeah, Martha visited. Martha visited famously. Right. She did, especially in New Jersey. Right. She'd come up here and I know she stayed in Somerville and of course Morristown. But in Somerville, they talk about her dancing with Kitty Green was quite an interesting person too. And Washington liked to dance with her, and Martha was a little upset, I think, what was going on at the time. Morristown, and then later at Middlebrook. Yeah. Yes.
Stillwell family, a prominent family here in Monmouth.
Oh, most definitely, yes. In fact, interesting about the Stillwell. That's oh, I'm not going to remember the real name, but that's an assumed name, the Stillwell, because they were Jacobins. They fought in the Civil War, the English Civil War previous, and when they came over here, and oh, I'm not going to give the name out because, but I it's on the tip of my tongue of what their original name was, but it definitely wasn't Stillwell. Nobody's asked the question I thought you would ask. Well, what about the cannon? Well, let me tell you what I think might have something to do with that. Down in Cape May, at the naval base there, speaking of the Stillwell family, there were sisters, Rebecca and Sarah Stillwell. According to legend, Rebecca and Sarah Stillwell were sisters who each performed heroic efforts during the Revolutionary War. Rebecca was at home near the American naval base on Beasley Point one autumn day in 1777 when she sighted armed British barges on the Egg Harbor River. All the men, including her husband, Captain James Willets, were away fighting elsewhere, leaving no one to defend the supplies and ammunition at the nearby base. Rebecca quickly assessed the seriousness of the situation and ran to set off the lone cannon that stood ready for emergencies. Under fire, the British barge was forced to back out to sea, saving the people, homes, and ammunition along the record. She fired a cannon. Says she fired them with the kids and scared off the British fleet. I'm sure that was a well-known story that was being traveled around. This is prior to the Battle of Monmouth. And as if that's not enough, Rebecca's sister Sarah also displayed unusual courage when she risked her life to save her husband, Captain Moses Griffin, who had been captured and imprisoned on an infamous British prison ship in New York Harbor. Sarah walked 100 miles from Beasley Point to General Washington's army in North Jersey, possibly when he was staying at the Hermitage, and Washington provided her with an escort to the British forces, but she was able to arrange a prisoner exchange to save her husband's life. Pretty fascinating. Interestingly enough, Moses Griffin finds his way I find him in Allentown the following October. He's part of a court of admiralty. There were courts of admiralty that were held, and quite a few were held in Allentown, New Jersey, of all places, because the Judge John Imlay, was from Allentown, and therefore it was convenient for him. Plus, it was a direct road down to the shore. It was the road today, 539. It'll take you right down to the shore area. It takes you down to Tuckerton. But it was another area, and that's where a lot of the courts and Moses Griffin is there suing for a prize, and might have been telling the story and might have encouraged this other woman to do what she did. Now, since then, as I said, I've been retired. I started to look at this a little further, and I started 25 years ago or more on this journey, essentially to try to include development around Allentown. We have been very successful, I'm proud to say. of preserving a green belt. And recently, most especially this summer, in fact, the last piece of this green belt was threatened with 500,000 square feet of warehouse development. It would place, it's a field between the border of Allentown and Route 195. The other side of Old York Road is preserved farmland. And it would just be such a shame to lose the green belt because of this last piece. Well, fortunately, we have, speaking of Major Andre, we have wonderful hand-colored maps that show the British encampments along the route to Monmouth, and specifically the British encamped throughout Allentown, but specifically on this site. And then we have an account of Colonel Morgan's riflemen sent by Washington to make first contact with the British, and he did at Allentown. And it's said that the troops lined up on one side of the creek and the British lined up on the other, and they fought a skirmish. And we were able to say that this land not only was an encampment site, but possibly the site of a skirmish. So we've been very successful in convincing people that the land should be preserved. And we've had a couple of articles in the paper about this, and actually got a spot on New Jersey Public Television News too. So we're quite proud of that. So I'm revisiting and rereading the accounts, especially Fatal Sunday by Mark Lender and Gary Stone. Wonderful book about the Battle of Monmouth, but looking more at the details, and I found some accounts from our old files that were returned to me recently, and I find that John Price Hunt had the title of Commissary of Horse Purchasing, and I have these I have this thing for, I guess because I was an accountant, this thing for these ledger sheets that show all these records. I love investigating them, and I find that he's responsible for Hunterdon County for the purchase of horses. And before the Battle of Monmouth, he's being paid thousands of dollars to purchase these horses, which is essentially their motor pool back then. And in Cranberry, there's a gentleman who was commissary of forage for the entire state, it appears, and his name was Elisha Lawrence, and he's from Upper Freehold, which is our town at that time. Allentown wasn't incorporated until 1889. And David Ray would become quartermaster at Allentown and appears as quartermaster. So you've got the forage master, the quartermaster, and the purchaser of horses, and they're all pretty tight. And Allentown, surprisingly, was quite a large town at that time. Not so much today, thank goodness. But David Ray was lieutenant colonel of the 4th New Jersey. He cited the cannon for Washington because the battle was fought on his properties, family's property. Ray, R-H-E-A. He allowed, Washington didn't know the terrain. Ray cites the cannon on Perrine Hill. He writes a letter to Washington. We've got a copy of that, and says that they're about to fire on his center. Washington is setting the troops up. This is after he met Lee, and they're setting Wayne and the troops to stand at the hedgerow to fight until the cannon could get a raid up on Perrine Hill. And then later, Ray takes a contingent of artillery and puts them up on Combs Hill towards the end of the cannonade, and it's what turned the tide. Up at where the visitor center is today, that you look out over through the entire, they got some Virginia cannon up there, and they were able to flank the British that way. And that's when the British decided that was enough. They had to retreat back to Freehold. But just fascinating. So, and then not only was he lieutenant colonel of the 4th New Jersey, but we have a gentleman by the name of David Brearley, who would eventually resign and become the first New Jersey chief justice, or one of the chief justices in New Jersey during the war. And he's lieutenant colonel of the 2nd New Jersey. So we have two gentlemen from Allentown at the battle at in very high positions. So there's more being developed here. And Lafayette had taken his detachment out too far, and I don't know if you know the area, but he's in Millstone, which is Millstone today, and he's following along the Shrewsbury Road, and it's only one road. So that baggage that came out of Imlaystown and the first division from Allentown all had to follow this narrow path to Freehold. And Lafayette is trailing him, and he cannot be supported by Washington anymore. And Hamilton comes into Allentown, and he needs somebody that could help him find his way around. And more so than anyone getting from Allentown and providing intelligence of the defenses, as I originally thought, made the connection here. I think more in terms now of someone, of a woman possibly guiding the troops and showing them, or at least a detachment of how to get around the area, because they were very unfamiliar with the roads. And that's also supported with tradition, because when I moved to Allentown, we have the tradition of Molly Pitcher, but we've also got a tradition of a woman by the name of Ginny Jackson, who led the troops from Trenton to the Battle of Princeton, that night march, the famous night march after the Second Battle of Trenton, which is another fantastic story. So, I mean, to have two women doing these heroic acts is a lot, and I think they're probably one and the same, and somehow people get confused, especially as we see with so much of history today, especially with this Molly Pitcher story. I mean, this whole book, 300 more pages, is just full of derivative accounts of essentially the same story over and over again. And the one primary resource account, I don't know if people are familiar with Joseph Plum Martin, Yankee Doodle, but it's not necessarily what I would call it's what Dr. David Martin calls a primary source, but he says it's a first-hand contemporary source from after the time of Revolution. It's not private Joseph Plum Martin's memoirs, his narrative. And it said, while in the act, a woman whose husband belonging to the artillery and who was then attached to a piece in the engagement attended with her husband at the piece the whole time. While in the act of reaching a cartridge and having one of her feet as far before the other as she could step, a cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs without doing any other damage than carrying away all the lower part of her petticoat. Now, come on. Yeah. But it gets better. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed it was lucky it did not pass a little higher, for in that case it might have carried away something else, and continued her occupation. Well, if that's not pejorative, it's just everything about it, especially from our perspective today, it's just outrageous. And then the woman, the two separate women, the Carlisle woman, the story about Monmouth. And then there's the woman, Margaret Corbin, who was supposedly, literally, the woman did support her husband, did fire the cannon for Washington, which is York, because they foolishly tried to hold Fort Washington, and her husband was killed, and she literally then was hit in the shoulder, and she did receive a pension, and she was what was known as the West Point Captain Molly. So that's when a lot of our folks talk about two separate Mollys, but they called her later Dirty Kate because it was said that she died of syphilis. Now, come on. I mean, it's just, the men just can't give it up. They just have to, they can't have a woman put into the story somehow. It's just very upsetting.
We have a hotbed of Tories living in Denver. We had some here. How did those folks, what did they do? Did they have to sign off that they did not follow the Queen, the King, anywhere? I mean, or did a lot of them leave?
Oh yeah, a lot of them did leave after the war. Some of them, though, that assisted, they weren't so they weren't hedgers. They didn't play both sides, but the ones that did, they actually got claims, and they went to Canada. So, a lot from Monmouth County. No, it wasn't just Perth Amboy. No, a lot from Monmouth County too. But it seems like studying this, they kept the Monmouth Tories in check though. And it was folks like the Middlesex militia and the Burlington militia, they put the squeeze on Monmouth, so to speak. And Monmouth then extended into Ocean County too. So it was a much larger area. But yes, there were quite a few Tories up in this area, but you were so close to New York. And that's where they were trading and they were making their money that way too.